The battlefield is an altar of suffering. Mud, thick with blood, swallows the broken bodies of the fallen. The air is choked with the acrid scent of burnt flesh and the whispering hymns of the faithful. Among the countless damned who march upon this earth, there is a procession unlike any other, one that does not merely endure the horrors of war, but embraces them as a path to salvation. The procession of the Sacred Affliction does not flinch at suffering. They revel in it, seeing in each wound and each loss a divine benediction. They move in solemn ranks, their bodies broken yet unbowed. Their robes, tattered and soaked in disease, cling to their flesh like sacred shrouds. Their faces, once human, now bear the lesions of the plague saint's blessing, a gift of affliction that sets them apart. The wind carries the murmurs of their prayers, chanted in tongues long forgotten, uttered between cracked lips that have known nothing but agony and devotion. A banner rises above them, stitched from the remnants of the fallen, an emblem of their purpose. Upon it, the sigil of their faith, a millstone, the weight of martyrdom they carry upon their backs. For the procession of the Sacred Affliction, suffering is not a burden, but a covenant, a holy contract sealed in pain and flesh. Their creed is simple. Faith must be tested through torment, and only in agony can one truly glimpse the divine. They march forward, undeterred by the machine gun fire that rakes the field. Their shields, engraved with the visages of long-dead saints, catch the bullets with an almost supernatural resilience. Each step they take into the storm of steel and fire is a declaration of faith, a testament to their conviction. They are not driven by fear or the mortal desire to live. They seek only one thing: suffering, the sacred language of their God. It began with a single man, a visionary or a madman, depending on the chronicler who tells the tale. His name has been lost to time, erased by the passage of war, and rewritten in the blood of his followers. But his legacy remains, carved into the very bones of the procession. He did not seek power, nor did he crave dominion over the battlefield. Instead, he sought communion with the divine through the ultimate act of sacrifice, disease. The plague saint, as he would come to be known, willingly embraced affliction. He cast away the comforts of health and plunged into the embrace of sickness, seeing in his rotting flesh a reflection of the divine's own suffering. His followers, drawn by the gravity of his conviction, took up his path, allowing the disease to ravage their bodies as a mark of their devotion. The affliction spread, not as a curse, but as a blessing, turning the procession into an unholy fusion of martyrdom and war. The world, ever cruel and blind to the faith of the devout, did not understand. The afflicted were cast out, their bodies deemed unclean, their devotion labeled as heresy. They were driven from the cities of men, shunned by those who still clung to mortal fears. But faith is never so easily extinguished. In exile, they only grew stronger. Their disease became their scripture, their bodies a living testament to endurance beyond the limits of flesh. They took to the trenches, to the ruined chapels and the forsaken battlefields, seeking the one place where their suffering would be met with neither scorn nor pity. War welcomed them as its own. Here, in the ceaseless churn of mud and blood, they found their true calling, not as exiles, but as warriors of faith. Their pain was their armor, their sickness their shield, their faith an unbreakable weapon. And so, the procession of the Sacred Affliction was born, not as a band of outcasts, but as a divine order. Their doctrine spread like wildfire through the ranks of the faithful. Warriors, broken and disillusioned, cast aside their feeble hopes of healing and embraced the saint's path. To suffer was to ascend. To rot was to be reborn. To march into the mouth of war was to offer one's body as a holy relic to the battlefield itself. Their heresy became their strength, their disease, a mark of sanctity, and the war, an eternal stage upon which their faith would be tested again and again until the world itself was consumed. To suffer is to be sanctified. This is the creed upon which the procession of the Sacred Affliction stands. Their bodies are their sermons, their wounds the scripture upon which their faith is written. Each lesion, each fevered dream, is a step closer to divinity. Their priests do not heal. They do not soothe. They do not speak of salvation in the afterlife, but of enlightenment through torment. Faith is not a whisper in the dark. It is a wail of agony, a scream of devotion that echoes across the trenches, carried on the wind alongside the scent of rot and burning flesh. Those who march beneath the tattered banners of the Sacred Affliction do not pray for deliverance. They do not seek mercy. They seek only to suffer as the divine once suffered. Their initiation is brutal, an ordeal of flesh and willpower. New initiates, whether willing converts or those too broken to resist, are anointed not with holy oils, but with the plague saint's touch. Open sores are pressed against fresh skin, sacred wounds shared between those who would walk the path. Fever is a trial, delirium a rite of passage. Those who survive emerge reborn, their bodies forever marked by the disease that now binds them to the faith. But suffering is not enough. The Sacred Affliction alone is merely a preparation for the true purpose of their existence: war. The procession does not merely endure the battlefield, they become part of it. The diseased flesh they carry is both weapon and shield. They move through the trenches unburdened by pain, their senses dulled by the rot in their veins, their devotion making them immune to hesitation or fear. Even as bullets carve through their ranks, they march onward, unshaken. The heretics fear them, not for their numbers or their weapons, but for the sheer inevitability of their advance. A soldier can fire upon a man who fights for power or coin, but what can they do against those who seek suffering as a gift? What fear can they instill in men who welcome death not as an end, but as a sacrament? Among the faithful, there is no retreat. No wounded are left behind. Those who fall do not cry out for help. They embrace the mud, offering their final breaths as a benediction to the battlefield. Their comrades do not mourn them. They anoint themselves in their blood and march on. For the procession, there is no greater heresy than cowardice. Their priests roam the battlefield like spectres, seeking out those whose faith wavers, whose flesh still clings to the notion of self-preservation. A whispered prayer is offered, a moment of reflection granted, before the millstone is placed around their neck. To hesitate is to falter is to betray the faith, and betrayal must be met with punishment. The millstones are sacred relics, each one carved with the names of martyrs, each one a weight both physical and spiritual. They are not simply used for executions, but for purification. Those found wanting are bound, their bodies dragged to the edge of the trenches and cast into the blood-choked mire below. Their deaths are not mourned, for they are necessary. Only the truly faithful may march forward. And so, the procession continues, unwavering, unbroken, moving ever onward into the heart of suffering. They will march until their bodies give out. They will fight until there is nothing left of them but bone and devotion. Because only through suffering can they be saved. The weight of faith is not metaphorical. It is real, cold, unforgiving. The millstones of the procession of the Sacred Affliction are not just symbols, they are judgments, heavy slabs of carved stone, each inscribed with the names of those who faltered, those who were deemed unworthy of suffering. They are carried upon the backs of the faithful as both punishment and proof of devotion, their crushing weight grinding down flesh and bone until nothing remains but willpower and faith. A burden accepted is a sin forgiven. A burden rejected is a soul condemned. Those who march beneath the sacred banners of affliction know this well. Their backs bend, their muscles burn, but they do not complain. To struggle beneath the weight of the millstone is to walk the path of the plague saint, to embrace suffering as an offering to the divine. Some collapse beneath the burden, their bodies failing them before their spirit can. Those who do are not granted rest. Their broken forms are left behind, swallowed by the trenches, their names etched into new millstones to be carried by those who march on. For the procession, death is never an escape. The faithful who falter are not given the luxury of burial or mourning. Their bodies are not removed from the field, for their suffering has not yet ended. They are bound, the sacred stones lashed to their bodies, and cast into the bloodied mud, left to drown in the filth and the prayers of the dying. This is their final penance. To the uninitiated, it is barbarism. To the faithful, it is mercy. A soul weighed down by doubt cannot rise to meet the divine. A body that rejects pain cannot claim salvation. The millstone is a gift, a reminder that suffering is not endured, it is embraced. Among the procession, there are those who bear the millstones not as punishment, but as an honor. These are the burdened saints, those whose devotion has transcended flesh, whose faith has become so absolute that they carry not just their own sins, but the sins of others. They do not march like men. They drag themselves forward, their bodies warped beneath layers of stone, their breath ragged from the weight that threatens to crush them with every step. They do not eat, they do not sleep. Their lives are spent in service to suffering, and their deaths are a spectacle of divine devotion. When the time comes, when their bodies can no longer carry the weight, they are brought before the procession's priests. The final blessing is whispered into their ears. Then, they are drowned in the trenches, bound in chains, their bodies cast into the depths like offerings to a starving God. It is not a cruel death. It is not tragic. It is salvation. Those who witness it are expected to carry the burden forward. The fallen are not mourned, they are envied. To bear the millstone is to walk in the shadow of the plague saint himself, to accept suffering not as a punishment but as a privilege. And so the procession marches, their backs bent beneath the weight of faith, their bodies breaking, their spirits unshaken. The trenches devour them one by one, but the march never stops. It cannot stop. Faith must be carried forward, no matter the cost. There are those among the procession of the Sacred Affliction whose duty extends beyond mere suffering. These are the Sacred Affliction Honor Guard, warriors not of conquest, but of preservation. They do not fight for land, nor for victory. They fight to protect the relics of their faith, to ensure that the memory of the afflicted endures beyond flesh, beyond pain, beyond time itself. Clad in armor corroded by time and disease, the Honor Guard marches in solemn ranks, their steps measured, their purpose absolute. Each is a sentinel of suffering, a guardian of the dead. Their duty is not to the living, but to the fallen, to the bodies that must not be forgotten, to the bones that must not be left to rot unmarked. The trenches are their cathedrals, the corpse-choked battlefields their sacred halls. They do not waver, they do not flee. They stand until their bodies crumble beneath them. Unlike the rest of the procession, the Honor Guard is armored not in rags and disease, but in plates of rusted steel, engraved with the names of those who have marched before them. They are walking reliquaries, their armor fused with the remnants of past saints, bones embedded into their gauntlets, skulls affixed to their pauldrons, rib cages reforged into breastplates. They do not carry their own burdens. They carry the burdens of the lost, the forgotten, the drowned. At their sides, they bear weapons of antiquity, long blades tarnished with age, axes that have carved through generations of heretics, shields engraved with the faces of saints, their gaze unyielding, watching, judging. These shields are not merely tools of war, they are divine testaments, forged from the iron of condemned cathedrals, blessed in the blood of the faithful. They turn aside bullets, break bayonets, and crush those who stand in defiance of their sacred duty. The Honor Guard does not fight with the frenzied zeal of the procession's frontline pilgrims. They fight with purpose. Their charge is not reckless. It is measured, precise, methodical. They advance in silence, a phalanx of suffering, their presence alone enough to send lesser men into retreat. Where they march, the battlefield becomes a mausoleum. But their most solemn duty is the retrieval of the fallen. No faithful of the procession may be left behind. No body may be abandoned. No martyr's remains allowed to sink into the filth unclaimed. When one of their own falls, the Honor Guard moves with grim efficiency, retrieving the corpse, securing the remains, ensuring that their sacrifice is not lost to the chaos of war. The fallen are carried upon the backs of the Honor Guard, lashed to their armor like sacred effigies. Some corpses are burned in ritual pyres, their ashes mixed into the soil of the battlefield. Others are interred within the reliquary shrines that the honor guard carries upon their backs, mobile sanctuaries of suffering, each containing the shattered remnants of those who have come before. The greatest among the honor guard, those who have carried more dead than the living can count, are granted a singular honor to become a relic themselves. When their bodies can endure no more, when the weight of suffering has ground them to the brink of collapse, their armor is sealed, their flesh encased in steel, and they are set upon the battlefield one final time. Their bodies may die, but their armor marches on. The dead fight alongside the living, their hollow frames moving with mechanical certainty, driven not by life, but by devotion. To be chosen for the honor guard is to forfeit the self. To wear their armor is to become history itself, a living monument to pain, to faith, to the ever-marching tide of suffering that defines the procession. And so they march, unbroken, eternal. The last to fall, the first to rise again. Because suffering must be witnessed, because faith must be carried forward, because the dead must never be forgotten. A shield is more than a tool of war. It is a symbol, a guardian, a silent oath. Among the procession of the Sacred Affliction, shields are not mere implements of defense. They are icons of faith, tangible testaments to suffering endured and salvation sought. Each one is a reliquary, a fragment of the divine, bearing the weight of devotion, just as the faithful bear the millstones of their sins. The shields carried by the afflicted are unlike any others found upon the battlefield. Forged not by smiths, but by the hands of the faithful, they are shaped from the remnants of desecrated altars, shattered cathedral doors, and the iron bones of long-fallen saints. Their surfaces are engraved with prayers, etched by hands trembling with fever and conviction. Some bear the faces of saints, their features warped by rust and age, their hollow eyes watching over the faithful as they march toward their martyrdom. Others are adorned with relics, the finger bones of holy men, shards of stained glass fused into the iron, fragments of scripture scrawled in blood and soot. Each shield tells a story. Some bear the impact marks of 1,000 bullets, dents and scars forming the script of their suffering. Others are blackened by fire, their edges melted, fused together by the heat of purging flames. To carry such a shield is to carry the weight of those who have marched before, to bear witness to their agony, to ensure that their suffering is never forgotten. The shields do not break, they endure, just as the procession endures. To the heretics, these shields are objects of terror. There is something unnatural in the way they withstand volleys of fire, how they seem to deflect bullets, not with force, but with faith. Even artillery shells have been known to break upon them, as if striking the unshakable resolve of the afflicted. Some whisper that the shields are touched by divine intervention, that they carry within them the spirits of the martyred, souls bound to iron, unwilling to let their faithful brethren fall so easily. But not all who bear these shields survive. The battlefield is merciless, and faith alone is not always enough. When a bearer of the shield is slain, their relic must not be left behind. The honor guard moves swiftly, retrieving the fallen and bearing their shields back to the sanctified forges of the procession. There, the shields are reforged, their shattered remnants melted and recast, their histories layered upon one another. No shield is ever truly lost, only remade, reforged, carrying forward the faith of those who once held them. To be given a shield is not a right, it is a burden. The shields of the procession are not granted to the strongest, nor the most skilled, but to those whose faith is unshakable, whose souls are prepared to carry the weight of suffering into battle. The act of receiving a shield is a ritual in itself, a night spent in silent prayer, fasting, allowing the sacred affliction to spread deeper into the flesh, marking the bearer as one who no longer fears pain or death. When the battle is joined, when the enemy's guns fire and the trenches churn with mud and blood, it is the shield bearers who stand first in the charge. They do not falter, they do not retreat. They advance, step by step, carrying the weight of their faith before them, deflecting the heretic's fury, carving a path through fire and ruin. Many fall, more rise to take their place, because faith cannot break, because suffering cannot end, because as long as one shield stands, damnation cannot claim them. To die is not the end. Not for those who march beneath the banners of the procession of the Sacred Affliction. For them, death is merely the final prayer, the last whisper of devotion uttered through bloodied lips before the veil of suffering is lifted. The battlefield is their altar, and upon it they offer their flesh, their pain, their very existence as the ultimate sacrifice. No soldier of the procession fears death. They welcome it. They do not flinch when the cannons roar, nor do they cower when the enemy's blades carve into their rotting flesh. They advance through storms of bullets, through trenches drowning in filth, through fire and ruin. Each step forward is a sermon, each wound a sacred offering. To bleed is to be blessed, to die is to be delivered. But even in death, their duty is not yet complete. When a warrior of the procession falls, their body is not left to decay in the mud like the unfaithful. The honor guard moves swiftly, retrieving the fallen, ensuring that their sacrifice is not in vain. Some are carried upon the backs of their brethren, their corpses bound to those still marching, so that even in death they may continue the pilgrimage. Others are sealed within reliquaries, their bones sanctified, their remains carried forward so that their suffering may inspire those who follow. There are those who do not fall in battle, but whose bodies have reached the very limits of endurance. For these chosen few, there is a different path, the final benediction. When their flesh can no longer carry them, when their eyes have dimmed but their faith still burns, they are brought before the procession's priests. Here, in the ruined husks of cathedrals long since reduced to rubble, they are given their last rites. A prayer, a whisper, a knife drawn across the throat. It is not an execution, it is an ascension. Their blood is collected in iron chalices, mingling with the sacred filth of the trenches. Their bones are woven into the shields of the next generation. Their names are etched into millstones, so that their suffering may weigh upon the shoulders of those who remain. Nothing is wasted, nothing is lost. The most revered of the fallen are granted the highest honor. Their bodies, still clad in armor corroded by devotion, are entombed within the battlefield itself. Their remains are fused with the very earth, their bones ground into the mud, so that every step the faithful take is upon holy ground. The procession does not mourn them. They become the foundation of their faith. Their spirits linger, whispering through the gunfire, watching over their brethren as they march ever forward. And so, the war does not end, it cannot end. As long as suffering remains, the procession will march. As long as faith must be tested, their banners will rise over the corpse-choked trenches. There will always be another battle, another sacrifice, another step forward into the unrelenting maw of war. Because salvation is not found in peace, salvation is found in suffering, and the procession will suffer until the end of all things. There is no end to this war, not for the procession of the Sacred Affliction, not for those whose faith is bound to suffering, whose march cannot cease, whose purpose is entwined with the agony of existence itself. Time erodes kingdoms, empires crumble into dust, but the procession marches on, their bodies decaying, their spirits unbroken. They are not merely warriors, they are relics of faith, living monuments to a truth that cannot be denied. The battlefield is their cathedral, and war is their only liturgy. They march through fire, through storms of steel, through the bones of those who have already fallen. Their armor has rusted away, their flesh sloughs from their bones, but they do not stop. They cannot stop. They have become more than men, more than flesh. They are faith incarnate, devotion made manifest. And faith does not die. There are stories whispered by those who have seen them, by heretics who have stared into their rotting eyes and felt something deeper than fear, something worse. A sickness in the soul, a knowing. They speak of warriors who do not fall, even when their bodies are torn apart, who fight long after their hearts have stopped beating. Some claim to have seen the dead rise again, clawing their way from the mud, their lungs still choked with blood, their limbs shattered but their hands still clutching rusted weapons. Others claim that the procession does not truly die at all, that they exist beyond the flesh, their forms no longer constrained by the frailty of mortality. That the whispers heard in the trenches, the cold breath on the backs of the damned, the unseen weight pressing down upon the souls of those who still doubt. These are the voices of the procession. The battlefield itself is infected with their faith. Their relics are carried forward, their bones reforged into weapons, their blood mixed with iron and oil. Even those who do not believe cannot escape them. They march in dreams, their chants echoing in the ears of the lost, their suffering bleeding into the minds of those who have yet to accept the burden of faith. The procession is not merely a warband, it is a truth that cannot be silenced, a truth that will never die. And so they march, forever, into the fire, into the ruin, into the unending carnage of war. There is no peace, there is no salvation, there is only suffering, and through suffering there is faith, and faith will march until the end of all things.